Hello, everybody. At least I hope it's live. Otherwise, I'm just much louder than I thought I was. And that's pretty loud. Hi, my name is Hannah Depp. I'm here to welcome you tonight to Politics in Prose, and thank you for spending your evening with us. Tonight, we are here to listen and discuss the book Empathy, Why It Matters and How to Get It by Krznaric, who I've been told to say his name boldly and without fear. As most of you know, we think of Politics in Prose as a place of community, so please help us treat it with respect and bear with me through some housekeeping. Please turn off or silence any and all wonderful technological gadgets you may have brought with you this evening. After our author speaks, we will have some time for questions and answers, and I would just like to remind everybody, as this is DC, that those are questions, not speeches. Please use the microphone that you see right there, because we do record these events for those who are not able to be here tonight. When our event sadly comes to a close, hold up your chair, lean it against something solid that is a great courtesy to your booksellers and helps us get our signing line going faster. After the event sadly comes to a close, we will have a signing right up here, so just line up to your left. If you have yet to get a copy of this wonderful book, it happens to be available right here at your very own independent local bookstore, surprisingly just up at the cash register. You can also sign up for any of our weekly emails or to get our calendar just up at the information desk, and thank you. Tonight's book addresses a word, an idea, and an action that we often say or throw around but rarely understand or deeply consider. Krznaric is a founding faculty member of the School of Life, responsible for such wonderful publications as his own How to Find Fulfilling Work, which has guided many a bookseller to this place, and what is, in our store anyway, a frequent bestseller, How to Think About Sex. He has founded the Empathy Library, studied at Oxford and London, holds a PhD, and has taught politics and sociology at Cambridge and City College London. He has worked with Oxfam and on human rights in Central America. But whether in working to promote the arts, inalienable rights, or simply to make us stop and listen to one another, empathy has been at his central mission. His blog Outrospection and videos featured there have become a central beacon for empathetic living, and I do recommend you check them out. Please let us lend an ear now to Roman Krznaric and his book Empathy.
Thank you. Is that on? Can you hear me? Yeah. Well, thank you for that introduction, and thank you all for braving Siberian winds to come here this evening to talk about empathy, which, of course, is the art of stepping into the shoes of another person and looking at the world through their eyes. And it's a topic that I've been interested in for about 14 or 15 years. And in fact, Hannah mentioned that I used to teach sociology and politics at Cambridge University, and I left my job there to study empathy, to not just look at the sociology and politics of empathy, but to look at it through the lens of anthropology and film and literature and neuroscience and psychology and so on. And that journey's been going on, as I said, for about 15 years. But what's kind of curious to me is that it was only a couple of years ago that I really understood why I was so obsessed with empathy. And it actually goes back to my childhood when I was a boy growing up in the suburbs of Sydney in Australia, which is where I'm from. And when I was 10, my mother died of breast cancer. And like a lot of kids who go through traumatic experiences, I lost a lot of my memories from before that age. But I also lost, I think, my empathy. I lost that capacity kind of to feel other people's feelings. I rarely cried or rarely laughed as well. And you know that feeling when you're sort of you're standing outside yourself, you can look down on your own life. I felt a lot of that. And so what I've realized is that my interest in empathy has kind of been driven by an unconscious desire to recover that empathic self that I think I'd lost as a child. And in a sense, that's what it's all about for me. And on my journey, trying to think about empathy and explore it, I think I found out two things, really. One is that empathy isn't just something that makes you good, but it's good for you too. It's a cornerstone of good relationships. Without empathy, we're emotionally tone deaf. It's that capacity to step into other people's shoes that enables us to get on with other people and realize ourselves as social animals. But empathy can do something more. A lot of people think of empathy as sort of a soft, fluffy concept, something kind of nice to have. And I think the opposite. I think empathy is fiery and radical, kind of dangerous in a way. And I believe it can create a revolution, and not, a kind of standard revolution of new laws and institutions and policies, but a revolution of human relationships. And that revolution, I think, is something that we urgently need. I mean, empathy is incredibly hard to measure, but the latest data shows that empathy levels amongst US college students have dropped by nearly 50% in the last 3 decades, the steepest decline in the last 10 years. At the same time, recent research issued by Pew Research showed a plague of online abuse and harassment and trolling. 73% of American adults have experienced that. So there seems to be a growing empathy deficit. And at the same time, we know that the world is full of toxic us versus them conflicts, whether it's between the major political parties in this country, between rich and poor, Palestinians and Israelis. And there's a real question of, well, can empathy do anything here to bridge those kinds of divides? And I think it can. And I think the way to think about it is the way I've sort of structured my new book on empathy, which is to look at the 6 habits of highly empathic people, ways to realize our empathic potential as individuals, but also as a society. So I want to talk about those 6 habits. But before I do, I just want to say a bit more about what empathy means, because as Hannah said, it's sort of a term that's sometimes used quite vaguely. So if you open a psychology textbook, you'll probably find 2 definitions of empathy in there, 2 different kinds. The first kind is what's called affective empathy with an A, which is empathy as a shared or mirrored emotional response. So if you, for example, see a child with an anguished face and you too feel anguish, that's affective empathy. You're sharing or mirroring their emotions. Now, if you look at the anguish on that child's face and feel a different emotion, like you feel sorry for them, you think, oh, the poor little thing, you feel pity, that's not empathy, but what's called sympathy. Right? Sympathy is an emotional response, but one that isn't shared, that isn't mirrored. And it's quite interesting that in the last decade, the frequency of Google searches for the word empathy have more than doubled, but the searches for the word sympathy have dropped by nearly 30%. In fact, just over 30%. So you've got affective empathy, which is about sharing emotions, mirroring them, suffering or joy. And the other kind of empathy is what's called cognitive empathy, or perspective-taking empathy. That's where you really try to imagine what is it like to be another person. You walk past a homeless guy and you think, what's it like to sleep out rough on a cold night like tonight? What's it like to be walked past without someone looking you in the eye? You try to imagine their experiences, feelings, their worldview, their way of looking at the world and at themselves. And it's something, it comes quite naturally to us. But this kind of cognitive empathy is often confused with something called the golden rule: do unto others as you'd have them do unto you. But as George Bernard Shaw once pointed out, he said, do not do unto others as you'd have them do unto you. They might have different tastes. Right? So that cognitive empathy is about discovering those different tastes. And I've seen how that develops even in my own kids. I've got twins, a boy and a girl. And when they were very young, about 1.5, before their natural empathy had kicked in, which normally happens about the age of 2, that cognitive ability to step in other shoes, when they're about 1.5, you get a situation like where my son would be crying and his twin sister would try and comfort him with her favorite toy dog, which was a kind and sympathetic gesture, but not much use to him at all. Fast forward a year when they were 2.5 and that cognitive ability had developed. Then if my son was crying, his sister would try and comfort him with his favorite toy cat. Right? That's the imaginative leap of empathy. She got it and she hadn't even read George Bernard Shaw. Right? So it's in all of us, it's in most of us. So those are these 2 kinds of empathy. And of course, that cognitive ability is really important for responding appropriately to other people. If we can't see that maybe their views, experiences, feelings, needs are different from ours, then we may well not respond in the right way. So it's very, very fundamental to any kind of conception of social change or social justice transformation. So those are the 2 kinds of empathy. But then what about these habits? How do you actually nurture empathy? Now, the first habit of highly empathic people I think of as, the term I use is to switch on your empathic brain. And what I mean by that is to understand the science of empathy as a foundation for developing empathy in everyday life. And there's been a great revolution in the science of empathy, or in fact the science of human nature in the last couple of decades. For most of the last 300 years, we've basically been told by our culture that human beings are essentially self-interested, individualistic creatures after their own private gain. But in the realms of neuroscience, evolutionary biology, and other realms, we've discovered that human beings are not just selfish creatures. Of course, we're self-interested, but we're something else. We're homo empathicus. You know, our brains are wired for empathy and social cooperation and mutual aid. 98% of people have the ability to empathize, to step into other people's shoes. And in fact, you may well have heard about mirror neurons, for example, these neurons that fire not just when you feel pain, but when you see somebody else in pain, or when you experience fear, you see someone else in fear. This is partly how we feel what other people feel, effective empathy. Now, there's a lot of debate about mirror neurons. In fact, the original research done on them was done on a really nasty species of monkey that showed no shred of empathy at all. So I wouldn't, don't think this is the answer to all of it. But there is a ton of neuroscience research telling us that we probably have a 10-section empathy circuit in the brain. You injure part of it in a car accident, you might lose the ability to recognize fear or other emotions on someone else's face. But though empathy is kind of wired into us, it's also something we can learn, like riding a bike or driving a car. You can teach children empathy, and there are amazing empathy teaching programs. And one that's got a lot of press in this city and others in the United States is probably the best known empathy teaching program called Roots of Empathy. Has anybody ever actually heard of Roots of Empathy? A few people. So the way it works, over 500,000 kids have done this. It started in Canada, it spread to this country, Australia, in the UK, other places. And the way Roots of Empathy works, this is true by the way, is that a class adopts a baby for the year, right? And this baby visits the class, admittedly with a parent and an instructor from the program, and the kids sit around the baby the baby's on a green mat. The kids sit around the baby and they start talking about the baby. Why is she crying? Why is she laughing? What's she thinking or feeling? And what are they trying to do? Empathy, of course. They're trying to step into the baby's shoes. And they use that as a jumping off point for doing drama and other kinds of activities. And the impact of Roots of Empathy is wonderful. It increases affective and cognitive empathy, but also decreases bullying in the playground, increases cooperation, and also increases general academic attainment. So I think every child should have the right to do programs like this, like Roots of Empathy. The problem, though, of course, is that we all are never going to be able to do Roots of Empathy, and we can't just wait 30 years for the next generation of empathic revolutionaries to come through programs like that. What can we do ourselves, and more broadly together, to expand our empathic potential? So that leads me to this second habit of highly empathic people. So you've got switching on your empathic brain, learning about that science of empathy. And the second thing is to what I think of as making the imaginative leap of empathy. Now, human beings have this really extraordinary ability, which is literally just by imagining yourself in someone else's position. In general, controlling for other factors, it increases our moral concern for others and motivates us to take action on their behalves. And there's a ton of research on this. If you get two groups of people, for example, to listen to the same recording of someone in distress, and you ask the first group just to listen to the bare facts of the recording, like someone who's had their parents killed in a car accident or something, and you ask the second group, so the first group you ask them to just listen to the objective facts, and the second group to do perspective-taking empathy, to try and imagine what it's like to be that person. All the studies show for the last 30 or 40 years that the second group, those who do the empathic perspective-taking exercise, are much more likely to give time and money and show concern for this person, even take into account difference of gender, religion, social background, urban versus rural, all this stuff. It's amazing. But there are a lot of barriers to empathy, as we know. Ideologies, political, religious, and otherwise, and it's a struggle to make that imaginative leap in other people's positions. And someone who I find inspiring in terms of making that leap is Mahatma Gandhi, who just before he was assassinated said something which is known now as Gandhi's talisman about the imaginative leap of empathy. It's a kind of a rule of thumb, a moral principle. What he said was this. He said, whenever you are in doubt, or when the self is too much with you, apply the following test. Recall the face of the poorest man who you may have seen, and ask yourself if the step you contemplate is going to be of any use to him. Then you'll find your doubts and yourself melting away. Okay? Now just imagine if that was on the screensaver of every Wall Street banker, or even on your own, what difference it might make. But of course Gandhi didn't just say empathize with the poor and the down and outs. He also said empathize with your enemies. He was a Hindu who said, I'm a Muslim, and a Hindu, and a Christian, and a Jew. And you can all think about, in your own lives, about the challenges of empathizing people who you may be in conflict with, whether it's a sibling you haven't spoken to for years or a manager who's making your life a nightmare. But it is interesting to look at, historically, moments when empathizing with enemies has really made a difference. And just to give you one example of this, from a kind of forgotten figure from the history of US race relations is a guy called C.P. Ellis, Claiborne Paul Ellis. Has anybody ever heard of this guy? I mean, he has been more or less forgotten, but he's very interesting. He was born in North Carolina in 1927, in County Durham, in the town of Durham, and he was from a poor white working class background. He was married, he had 4 kids, he worked as a car mechanic, he couldn't make ends meet. And like his father before him, he started blaming his problems on African Americans. And like his father before him, he joined the Ku Klux Klan. And he rose through the ranks and became an exalted cyclops, a leader of the Ku Klux Klan. And, you know, when Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated in 1968, he did what a classic white supremacist did. He had a party in his car mechanic's workshop. And then in 1971, though, his life changed dramatically. He was invited to a 10-day community meeting to try and tackle race problems in local schools. And he was invited because he was a prominent and powerful member of the local community. And he went along to the first meeting with a machine gun in the back of his pickup truck. And he got there, and to his horror, in a way, and surprise, he was elected as a co-chair of an organizing committee to make this 10-day exploration of race problems, come together. And he was co-elected with as the chair of this organizing meeting with a woman who he hated with a passion, who was an African-American civil rights activist called Ann Atwater. And he and Ann Atwater spent the next 2 days trying to recruit people to their organizing committee, and they met up after those 2 days, and Ann Atwater said to CPLS, she said, I've been knocking on the door of people in my community and nobody wants to open the door because I'm working with a Klansman. And then he said, the same thing's happening to me. Nobody wants to speak to me because I'm working with an activist like yourself. And she said, my daughter came home crying from school today because kids were making fun of her because of me spending time with you and working on this with you. And he said that the same thing had happened to his own son. In fact, one of the school teachers had been making fun of his son. And what CPLS discovered was that he had a lot in common with Ann Atwater. In fact, also that they shared the oppression of poverty. At the time, he was working as a janitor at Duke University. She was a domestic cleaner. And these conversations with her totally blew away his prejudices. He started to see her as an individual human being. And at the end of this 10-day community meeting, he stood up in front of 1,000 people and he tore up his Ku Klux Klan membership card. Right? And he later became a leader of the Janitors Union, which was 70% African American and a very prominent civil rights activist in the 1970s. I think his story tells us something about the power of conversation, particularly to help us for empathy to overcome even the most extraordinary social divides. But then there's a question of, well, what does this all mean in your own lives? And how can empathy be applied to your own relationships? So I'd like you to do something for me. When I give you the signal, just when I give you the signal, I'd like you to get into a pair with someone next to you or behind you, ideally someone you didn't come along with tonight, and I want you to just spend 2 minutes discussing this question. Who in your life do you need to develop more empathy with, and how might you do it? So the question is, who in your life do you need to develop more empathy with, and how might you go about doing it? So on the count of 3, I want you to blow the roof off politics and prose. 1, 2, 3, go! You have 1 minute left. Okay, can I have your attentions again, please? I know it just goes so quick. Not very empathic of me to break up your conversations, but you can talk with strangers and others a bit more afterwards, if you like. So as you're having those conversations, you might have been puzzling about that kind of second part of my question, which is how do you go about practicing empathy in reality? Because, yeah, okay, you can make that, you can imagine yourself in someone else's position, but what really more can you actually do to practice it in reality? And that brings me on to the third habit of highly empathic people. So the first one was switching on your empathic brain. Second one, making the imaginative leap of empathy. The third one is to practice the craft of conversation, which of course is what you were just doing. That was quite sneaky of me. Now we all know that conversation and empathy kind of go hand in hand in many ways. You know, you've probably been in a situation where, you know, you're arguing with your husband or wife or your partner and you just thought, oh God, I wish they could just see things from my point of view. I wish they could just understand where I'm coming from, right? Well, what are you asking for? Empathy, right? You want them to step into your shoes, you know, if only for a moment. And what that really brings up is the question of the art of empathic listening. You know, how do you make empathy work in these situations, you know, when you are arguing with your partner or you're fighting with someone at work or something like that? And what the research shows, and particularly research done by a guy called Marshall Rosenberg, a psychologist who was trained by Carl Rogers about 40 years ago, you might know about him. He invented something called nonviolent communication. Marshall Rosenberg says something very interesting about empathic listening. He says, basically, when you're in those tense situations, what you've got to do is this. Do two things. Listen out for the other person's feelings and listen out for the other person's needs. Those two things. And even try and give people the space to articulate their feelings and needs. Maybe even ask them what their feelings and needs are. And it is extraordinary how it can reduce the tension. Because in the end, we really just want to kind of be listened to, you know, whether you're a child or an adult. And Rosenberg goes even further and says, you know, if you really want this to work, actually try and reflect back to the other person what they've just said so that they understand that you understand them. And he gives a very interesting statistic. He says that in workplace disputes between employers and employees, if both sides agree when they sit down to literally repeat what the other person just said before they reply themselves, you reach conflict resolution 50% faster, right? And that can be applied in the workplace, you know, in the boardroom and in the living room. So I think it's worth trying to practice that empathic listening, see if you can develop that habit of doing it and reflecting back as well. But I think we need to just practice the art of empathic conversation, not just with people we know, like with our families or kids and partners, but also on the streets by nurturing our curiosity about strangers. Because I think the reality is that one of the great barriers to empathy are the assumptions and stereotypes we have about people based on their looks, their clothes, their accents, and so on. I mean, we are so often wrong about people, aren't we? You know, there used to be this homeless guy who lived around the corner from where I live in the UK, in Oxford, and I walked past him for several years without stopping. I never thought I'd have anything in common with him. He used to be kind of muttering kind of crazily to himself. He wore no shoes in the snow. And but one day I did stop and talk to him. And I found out his name. His name was Alan Human, quite unusual name. Turned out he had a philosophy degree from Oxford University. And we developed a friendship based on our interest in Aristotle and pepperoni pizza, you know. But it's extraordinary that, I've been walking past him for years, and I think highly empathic people, and I'm struggling, I wouldn't call myself an empathy master, try and practice that kind of curiosity about strangers to try and get beyond superficial talk and discover who is behind that facade that we see and that we judge all the time. And there's this great movement which began in Denmark about 10 years ago to try and nurture curiosity about strangers on a large scale, called the Human Library movement. And I don't know if it exists in this country, but it's expanded to over 20 countries. And the Human Library put on events. Anyone can do one of these. And what you do is you go along to a Human Library event, and instead of borrowing a book, like you would do from a normal library, you borrow a person for conversation. And there are volunteers there who you can talk to, maybe a Muslim teenager or a miserable investment banker or, a soul musician or whoever it is. And so have a look at humanlibrary.org if you're interested, see if there are any, or do put on your own human library. But in general, we can still nurture curiosity about strangers easily in everyday life. Just have a conversation with a stranger once a week, that gets beyond superficial talk. Talk about the stuff that matters in life, politics, prose, religion, family, whatever it happens to be for you. So I think we can develop that habit of practicing the art of empathic conversation, the craft really of conversation. But if you really want to take empathy to the extreme, you can practice the fourth habit of empathy, which is to seek experiential adventures. What I'm talking about here is the idea that empathy can be kind of more extreme than ice climbing or, hang gliding. And this is a kind of empathy which is where you literally try to physically embody, experience somebody else's life, right? Now, how do you do that? Well, you've probably got a copy around here somewhere of George Orwell's book Down and Out in Paris and London. In the 1920s, Orwell's, who was from a very privileged background, he went to Eton. He swapped his clothes, his natty suit to go tramping, be a hobo on the streets of East London. And he was trying to cross the divide of class. But someone who really inspires me is someone who tried to cross the divide of generation, a woman called Patricia Moore, who is one of this country's most famous product designers, industrial designers. Again, not many people know about her, but she's one of the great empathic adventurers of the last century. And let me just tell you a little story about her, because in fact she's more familiar to you than you probably realize. In the 1970s, when she was 26 years old, she was working as a designer, in fact the only woman designer out of 350 men at one of this country's most famous design firms called Raymond Loewy in New York. They designed the curvy Coca-Cola bottle and the Shell logo and stuff. And she was in a meeting about the design of something really boring, so it seemed, which was the design of a refrigerator door. And Paddy Morse, she said to one of the senior male partners, she said, couldn't we design the fridge door so it was easy for an older person with arthritis to open? And one of these senior managers said to her, he said, Paddy, we don't design for those people. Yeah. And of course this made her very angry. So she decided to become one of those people, to become an 85-year-old woman with arthritis. That's right, she made herself up. She hired a professional makeup artist to make her look kind of older and wrinkled. She put on fogged up glasses so she couldn't see, uneven shoes so she was hobbling. She bound up her arms and legs with bandages and her hands so she couldn't, pick up a can opener or open a fridge door. And when she was ready in her disguise, and when she was 26, she literally looked 85 years old. I wish I could show you a picture of her. She then went out in her disguise and visited over 100 US cities between 1979 and 1982 to see how people treated her, to see what it was like trying to open and close department store doors, go up and down subway stairs, open fridge doors, use tin openers and things like that. And at the end of her 3-year experience, she came up with some major innovations in design which are still around with us today. The most general innovation was was one of the key inventors of something called universal design, the idea that any object like a cup like this should be designed so it can be used by someone who's 85 or 5. It should be non-discriminatory. But you'll also know about her if you open up your kitchen drawer, and you may well be able to pick out one of those thick rubber-handled tin openers or can openers. That's her idea. It's called the OXO Good Grip. It was designed after this experiment. Someone with arthritis can pick it up, right? This has changed in a small way millions upon millions of people's lives. And I think her empathy immersion tells us something about the power of experiential empathy to both nurture creativity but also to transform society in various ways. And you might think, okay, well, how am I going to practice this experiential empathy. I'm not going to dress up as an 85-year-old or whatever it happens to be, or go on the streets of East London or, you know, East Washington, I don't know, like George Orwell. But you can practice experiential empathy. I mean, just a couple of months ago, tens of thousands of people in this country were part of an anti-poverty campaign called Live Below the Line, where they lived on $1.25 a day for 5 days in a row, which is the amount of money that 1 billion people on the planet live on. You know, that was trying to do experiential empathy, a moment of solidarity. If you're going on holidays to a beach in Mexico or Thailand for 2 weeks, yeah, lie on the beach for a week, but think of spending a week, you know, volunteering in a local school, being a teacher, or if you're a member of a particular religion, do a God swap and spend a month going to the services of different religions, you know, or in a meeting of humanists. That's what Nelson Mandela did when he was in prison on Robben Island. He was brought up as a Methodist. He went to every religious service. That's experiential empathy. So that is the fourth habit of highly empathic people, experiential empathy. But you might well be thinking like, oh, God, isn't there just an easier way? You know. And the fifth habit is a bit easier, which is the idea of traveling in your armchair, which this bookstore is very good for. What I mean by that is the idea of empathizing by reading books, watching films, going on those imaginative journeys. And we've all done it through film and literature. You know, you open To Kill a Mockingbird. What is the central line of that book? It's, you never really understand another person until you step inside of his skin and walk around in it for a while. You know, it's all about empathy, of course. And when I was writing my book on empathy, I thought, what I'm going to do, right, is bring together all the best films and novels and compile them in one spot and put them in my book. But I couldn't find them. I couldn't find them online anywhere. And so what I did is in my frustration, I recently launched a website which really exists, and you can go to www.empathylibrary.com. And the Empathy Library is a place that anyone can go to, anyone can join, and you can find hundreds of books and films, video shorts, children's books, all on the theme of stepping into other people's shoes. Books like To Kill a Mockingbird and film as well. Films like City of God, all sorts of different things. George Orwell's Down and Out in Paris and London. And anyone can add to it. And it's extraordinary how it's growing. People are hungry for this. You know, reading groups are using it and film clubs and stuff like that. So do this evening go home and have a look at empathylibrary.com. So that's the fifth habit of empathy, that tonight, you know, you can go away and read a book, watch a film, make the imaginative journey into the life of a teenage girl in Tehran or whatever it happens to be. But let me just say something now about the final habit of empathy, the sixth habit, which is to inspire a revolution. And what I mean by that is the idea that, you know, normally when we think of empathy, we think of it as about individuals coming to understand each other. But empathy can also exist on a mass scale, on a collective level. You know, we always hear about moments of mass empathic collapse, the Holocaust, the Rwandan genocide, and so on. But what about moments of mass empathic expansion? And there have been many throughout human history. They're very, very important. I mean, just to give you an example of one, in fact, I just found a book just behind me with a photograph of one of them. You probably won't be able to see it very well, but there's a photograph there of a young girl in a textile mill in South Carolina in 1908. It was taken by Lewis Hine. And you may well know this, that about 100 years ago, the National Child Labour Committee formed a campaign to try and tackle child labour in this country. 1 in 6 children were working in coal mines, textile mills, glass factories, a lot of them. They were shucking oysters at 3 o'clock in the morning. And the National Child Labour Committee hired this social documentary photographer, actually an ex-school teacher, Lewis Hine, to sneak into these workplaces and take photographs of the children. A lot of people didn't even believe it existed. And there were exhibitions of his photographs, and they were printed in newspapers, and they caused a huge public outcry. Not only could people see the reality of child labour, but they could see the faces of these children. It created an empathic outpouring. They were no longer statistics. And the impact was extraordinary. It led to the formation of the Federal Children's Bureau in 1912, and it helped halve the number of child workers between 1910 and 1920. Now, what that particular example of mass empathy tells us is it's an example of what I think of as a kind of a law of history, which is this, that empathy opens the door of our moral concern, and then laws and rights wedge that door open. Right? Don't think of empathy and law or public policy and so on as separate things. they've almost always gone together. Empathy expands our concern for neglected, suffering, and marginalized group, whether it's in the struggle against slavery in the 18th and 19th centuries, the struggle for women's rights, indigenous rights, gay rights, disabled rights, the list goes on. These things go together. And I think we should be trying to look to support organizations which are trying to create this kind of mass scale of empathy. And just give you an example of one that I like very much, which operates in Israel and Palestine, called the Parents Circle. And it's quite amazing. It brings together Israeli and Palestinian families who all have something in common, which is they've all had family members killed in the conflict. It brings them together for story sharing, so they recognize that they share the same pain and the same blood. But they also do really fantastic public campaigns. And the one that I liked the most was one they did called the Hello Peace telephone line. And the way it worked was this, was that any Israeli could phone a free phone number, which was on billboards all across the country. They could phone this number, and they were put through to a Palestinian stranger to talk to them about whatever they liked for up to half an hour. And then Palestinians could call this number, and they could talk to an Israeli. And in its first 5 years of operation, over 1 million calls were made on the Hello Peace phone line. Yes, some of them were screaming matches, but many of them ended up in friendships. And just imagine today if you created similar phone lines or Skype campaigns connecting climate change activists and climate change skeptics, or Wall Street bankers and people who had their homes repossessed, and so on, the way it could create grassroots empathy on a mass scale. So I think we need to support organizations like that. I think we need to teach empathy in schools, but I think we need to do something more. And this is what I'm working on at the moment, which is to create new empathy cultural institutions. And the one I'm focused on is to create the world's first empathy museum. And the Empathy Museum is very real. It's going to launch in London next year, in June, in London's biggest cultural centre, the South Bank Centre, and it's then going to go travelling around the world. I'd love to bring it to Washington. And what happens at the Empathy Museum is that you go along and you try and experience somebody else's life. There's going to be a human library where you can borrow people for conversation. You go into another room and there'll be 20 sewing machines and some former Vietnamese sweatshop workers who will show you how to make a shirt under sweatshop labor conditions. You will do it and get paid a few cents at the end, just like they did. There'll be a brain booth where you can go in and get your empathy levels of your brain measured. And you can, if you're interested in the Empathy Museum or being part of it, go to the website empathymuseum.com, and there's a rather cool video all about it there, and you can discover all about it. And so it's going to be traveling the world starting in the middle of next year, but it's also going to exist online as well. So that's the Empathy Museum. Let me now just finish though with a final thought, because my phone's run out, so I've lost quite a bit of track of time, but I think I'm all right. So you've got those 6 habits of highly empathic people. Switch on your empathic brain, make the imaginative leap, to practice the craft of conversation, seek experiential adventures, to travel in your armchair, and finally to inspire revolution, do empathy on a big scale. And you can all think to yourselves in your own lives which of those habits you might want to try and cultivate more. And and think to yourself as you walk out of here tonight, what single act could you perform in the next 48 hours to bring a bit of empathy revolution into your own lives? But let me just say one final thing before we have some questions, which is the importance of balancing introspection with what I think of as outrospection. Right? So in the last century, the basic message has been this, in psychology and self-help and so on, that the way to live a good life is to look inside yourself, understand yourself. Socrates said, know thyself, and we think of this as being about self-reflection. That's the message that's been sent by everyone from Sigmund Freud to Oprah Winfrey. Right? Now, that self-reflection and looking inside is important, but I think we need to balance that introspection with outrospection, which is the idea of discovering who you are and how to live by stepping outside yourself and discovering the lives of other people and other cultures. And I believe that empathy is the ultimate art form for creating a new age of outrospection, and that we should be trying to bring out our latent empathic potential, this homo empathic, which is inside all of us. It makes sense if our brains are wired for empathy, even if our social institutions aren't promoting it, to try and nurture it in our own lives, in our own relationships, and in our own communities. And if we do that, I think we can start creating the revolution of human relationships that we so urgently need. Thank you. But now, time for questions. And I think what you have to do, go up to the microphone.
There's a mic right there, so we can hear you, and they can hear you on the recording.
I can articulate loud enough without a mic.
We're recording it for people who
who aren't here.
And ask me anything, more or less anything.
This won't get you mad, will it?
State of origin, Queensland. That makes me furious. I'm from New South Wales. Anyway.
No, okay.
Yes.
Hi, my question has to do with the limits of empathy, and in particular with I'm thinking of evil. The other day there was a great presentation on Churchill, and I was thinking of the way the presenter talked about it, that he was anything but empathic to the forces around him at that time, when the world seemed very empathic, if that's the word to use, with Hitler. And where's the limits of this with something like that, or ISIS now, and what we're seeing? So could you address that?
Yeah, so there's a question there about empathy and evil and the limits of empathy. I think, just as a sort of a general point, one of the big critiques of empathy, and this sort of addresses the question of evil in a sort of a larger context than just, say, ISIS or Church and so on, is the idea that one of the biggest problems of empathy is authority. If somebody tells you to do something, human beings' empathy will be overridden. This is what the evidence shows. You know, the classic case, of course, was the Eichmann trial in Jerusalem in 1961, where Eichmann said that, you know, he was a willing executioner in the Holocaust, but he was just following orders, following rules. And you'll probably know about the classic experiment by Stan Milgram at Yale University called the Milgram test, where experimental subjects were brought into a room and they asked a subject in another room to do basically a memory test, and if they got a question wrong, they gave them an electric shock, and if they got another question wrong, they gave them an even larger shock, and so on. And the famous finding was that 65% of people would give electric shocks to a level which would kill somebody, basically. And so because they were ordered by a man in a white coat to keep going. Right? And so the idea then is that, okay, well, empathy is much weaker than things like authority. This is an origin of evil. But if you look at that piece of research by Stan Milgram and replications of it, you find something very interesting. First, if the experimental subject you give electric shocks to isn't in another room, but is actually in front of you and you can see them, the level of drops from 65% of giving deadly shocks to down to about 20 or 30%. But then, if you've got somebody else in the room with you who refuses to do the test, in almost every single case, about 94% of cases, you too will stop giving those electric shocks because you're sort of there's someone there you can be in solidarity with. And it tells us something very important about how evil works, really. And I think that's, it's not a direct answer to the question, but it's one way of thinking about that actually the barriers to evil are sort of more complicated than we think. Yeah.
Right. Well, I have a question about, I guess this would be in the area of your experiential adventures, but it comes from what you call it, where the rubber meets the road, and the experience of people who work in ICUs, particularly pediatric ICUs or children's cancer wards, as to burnout, the question of burnout.
Yeah.
And it's interesting about the idea of cognitive empathy versus expressive or emotional empathy, and that cognitive empathy can be seen is not what we call a compassionate experience, because psychopaths and confidence men have a lot of cognitive empathy, but not expressive empathy.
Okay.
And that's been called the fiery furnace of empathy. There is a very well-known work by the secular saint of medicine, Sir William Osler, who was knighted at Oxford, called Equanimitas, in which he mainly talks about the idea that doctors have to develop a sense of detachment in their work, or else they can't function.
Yeah.
And I've always had trouble with that because it's so easy to slide from detachment into indifference.
Yeah. Okay. So
And do you deal with that at all?
Yeah. Yeah. And I write about all that stuff in the book. So let me say something about that. So there's a question there of, well, first in the beginning, about too much empathy, what's sometimes called empathic over-arousal, you know, and it can happen. There are people who feel absolutely overwhelmed, and it can sometimes paralyze them into inaction. If I see a child, if I hear like a story from a friend about their child being very ill or you know, paralyzed or something, you know, I've heard terrible things, it's sometimes just too much for me to bear, right? Because especially since I've had children. But there's something very interesting, is that there is, a lot of people think that people with high levels of this affective empathy, that it paralyzes them. But actually, as far as I can see, there is no evidence that those people who have very high levels of affective empathy, who often feel overwhelmed, are actually less likely. There's no evidence that they're less likely to take action on the behalf of other people. In fact, they're more likely to take action on the behalf of other people. Doesn't mean it's easy to absorb that kind of suffering of other people, but it's very interesting that it doesn't seem to stop them. And I think when it comes to like doctors and so on, I think what the evidence shows is like good doctors, they're able to kind of shift between the affective and cognitive empathy. They don't just try, you know, if a patient in front of them is full of anxiety, they don't want to try and feel all that anxiety. They want to understand that anxiety in that cognitive sense so that they can respond appropriately. And of course, you're right that there are people, the sort of sociopaths, who have that ability to step in your shoes but make no affective or emotional connection. But that's actually quite rare. For most of us, the affective and the cognitive work together. And those people who work in areas where there is a lot of emotional stuff going on, whether they're answering calls on a suicide line, humanitarian aid workers, working on trauma wards, most people there, they tend to find ways of keeping a little bit of healthy distance. Sometimes it's done through humor. Sometimes it's done by, you know, debriefing, as psychotherapists do. Or, you know, if you're taking suicide calls, you don't take one after the other. You stop. You recognize what your own limits are. In a sense, what ultimately you try to do is you try to fit your own oxygen mask before you fit anybody else's. Yeah. So there's some thoughts on that. Thanks.
Some ways it's along the same lines, just the dark side of empathy and the space that I see for more critical thinking about that. So again, at the political level and at the very personal level, not necessarily with psychopaths who take advantage of other people's goodwill and empathy, but it's a fairly common phenomenon for manipulation to occur, for exploitation to occur in families, ordinary families, in families that are a little off kilter. The potential for enabling antisocial behavior ultimately by empathizing with the other is a real risk. It's an everyday risk. So it was just in your empathy library, is there anything you have there about that kind of thing, thinking about it critically, and especially teaching children, if teaching empathy has to begin at that level? It's too easily coded as a virtue. More is better. More is better. You're a more loving person. Give, give, give. Where do we teach our children? How do we teach them to recognize limits for themselves, how to think about it intelligently, and to think about it, not simply to do it recursively? Because as much as we need more empathy in the world, there's also a flip side which gets a lot less attention, which is, it seems, that at the very local, mundane level, there's a lot of potential for, using the empathetic other as in a way that's not healthy, and so on. So,
yeah. So there's a real question there, and it's a really good question about what I think was the problem of the instrumental empathy. You know, where you're really trying to step into someone else's shoes in order to manipulate them, basically. I mean, the classic case where this occurs, not just in families, but is in marketing. There's this new idea of what's called empathy marketing, right? Which is basically you try and understand the perspectives of your clients and customers and so on, but really that's about stepping into someone else's shoes in order to sell them another pair, right? I'm not particularly happy about fast food companies trying to understand how my children think and experience the world in order to sell them hamburgers that are going to set them on a fast track to heart disease. But of course I wouldn't call that kind of empathy marketing. I just call it marketing, right? And so, but I think it is important to think about the limits. I've sort of lost the person who asked the question. Where's she gone? So I can see it. Oh, there you are. Sorry. I think it is very important to think about all sorts of different limits to empathy. I mean, in general, I think that we live in a world where we're basically taught the opposite. Our institutions are organized not to help empathy flourish, but to crush it. Schools are basically organized along very competitive lines and rewarding children for beating other children. Organizations, not beating them up, I mean, doing better than them, in exams and so on. And businesses are organized along these lines as well, the way that financial incentives work and so on. So I think in that context, I think it is very important to teach children empathy, but it is important to teach that this is not about, manipulating other people to bring the affective and the cognitive together. And actually, it's really curious seeing how, if I just thinking of my own children, empathizing comes really naturally to my daughter. I have twins, they're now 6, actually. Comes very naturally to my daughter, but not to my son. And so there's a question of, well, how do I try and nurture it in my son? Should I try to nurture it in my son? He's got other interests, he's got great curiosity and so on. But I have, and my partner and I, we both started teaching our kids the distinction between the golden rule and the platinum rule. So the golden rule, remember, was do unto others as you'd have them do unto you. And the platinum rule is do unto others as they would have you do unto them. Right? And what I do with them is, I don't say you must do this. I try and get them to understand a situation, what's going on. Like the other day we were watching Pocahontas, the film of Pocahontas, and I say to them, okay, the guy who's come from Europe to conquer the Americas, as it were, is he doing the golden rule or the platinum rule? This kind of thing. And it's giving my children the language to explore empathy without kind of imposing it too much, I think is really helpful to them. But, as you say, we need to raise some of the issues and problems of it. And there's been some good critiques of empathy in the press in this country in the last year. The Yale psychologist Paul Bloom wrote a good article in the New Yorker called The Baby in the Well. I completely disagree with everything he said, but it was sort of cogently argued. In fact, I wrote an article at salon.com, if you're interested, a counter to him just last week. And I don't want to go on too much about his critiques because I'm conscious of other people, but let me just mention one of them. He, for example, says, look, the problem with empathy is that it doesn't work well at a distance. That is, we empathize more with people close to us and not with people in faraway places. Therefore, it is a poor basis for moral decision-making and public policy. It's too kind of inconsistent. And I think he's completely missing the point there as a red herring, really, that the problem is not distance. It's about giving people a human face. We know you can walk past someone who lives on your street, a homeless person or whoever, without looking them in the eye, just as you can empathically connect with someone on the other side of the planet who's been in an earthquake in China. If you can see their face, hear their story in a TV report or something like that. The question is, how do we get beyond abstraction and start to treat people with humanity, and then try and connect empathy to policy change? Because without those kinds of connections, you don't get the expansion of rights.
Just to be the least empathetic person here, we have time for about one more question, but you'll be up here signing.
Sorry, I'm answering too long. I'll be very quick.
So you can come up as well. You can come up and talk during the signing as well,
Yeah.
even if you're not getting a signed book. It's fine.
I did have a 2-part question.
Okay. Let's hope it's the same question everyone else was going to ask.
So the first one is about the science, a question about the science, and
Yeah.
the second is a comment about the application. So on the science front, I was curious about whether our mirror neurons are stronger for people we believe are more similar to us, and whether we have to work harder if they're outside of our tribe to see the commonalities. So that was the science question. Then the application question was, when you talk about empathetic conversation and having them with others,
Do you also talk about having them with yourself? Because I'm struck by your story. I mean, did you need to go back and empathize with that 10-year-old who lost his mother and be able to inquire of yourself about your feelings and your needs? Is that a starting point before you can do it with others?
Okay, so the first question is really about in-groups and out-groups. I don't know if there is actual research on mirror neurons that relate to this issue of whether you're more likely to empathize with people who are part of your own social group or not. But certainly there's research showing that, of course, we tend to empathize more with people who are like us than are not like us. White judges give more favorable rulings to white-collar criminals, you know, people who are a bit like them. And this is one of the questions that Paul Bloom raises in his article in the New Yorker and Boston Review recently, the problem of empathic bias, right? But to me, I think, you know, that just because we're more likely to connect with people who are like us than not like us, that's exactly the reason to try and get beyond our peer groups and try and expand or deepen our empathy and talk to strangers and go beyond the in-group to the out-group. Now, the second question was about, just remind me again?
Internal empathic conversation.
Ah, yes, right, self-empathy. Right? This is a new concept, self-empathy, self-compassion, been around since the 1990s. And the idea, though, and I do write about this in my book, and their importance, but of course they might be new words in English, but the concept of that kind of self-empathy is very old. It goes back to Aristotle. If you read Aristotle's ethical writings, he talks about a concept called philautia, which is self-love. Right? And he says there's two different kinds of self-love. There's a kind of a nasty narcissistic form, which is all about, you know, greed and self-advancement and so on. But there's actually a good kind of self-love that if you like yourself and are good to yourself, then you'll have a lot of love to give others. You know, he famously said, all friendly feelings for others are an extension of man's feelings for himself. And I think that goes to the heart, that that kind of self-empathy in many ways is a foundation for expanding our empathic horizons.